If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who spend time in seclusion, what is the scariest thing you have witnessed out in the woods? I had my back up against a ponderosa, chilling there on the trail. I think I had a notebook for merit badges or for drawing. I don't recall. So this red squirrel comes out and grabs this nice fat green pine cone and starts to give it a good come to papa looking over. Right then, he perks up, looks down the path, grabs the cone and scrambles up the tree and out on the limb about 30 feet over the path holding that fat, pitchy green pine cone. So I see what spooked him. Up the trail comes this big, fat bastard eastern gray squirrel. An invasive pest species, essentially a big fluffy evil tree rat that preys on birds, mice, chipmunks, etc. The gray starts sniffing around where the pinecone had been, giving the ground a scratch. Red, 30 feet up, flings the hard, green pinecone down from the limb above, right onto Gray's head. Gray gets knocked for a loop. Just as he's recovering, 1 second later, Red jumps and performs a pile driver right on his face from 30 feet up, knocking his ass senseless. Red doesn't miss a beat but hightails it down the path with a good 50-yard lead. Gray gets up and tears after Red, hell-bent for leather, but Red was already rounding the bend out of sight. Then, later that afternoon, I caught our scoutmaster taking pictures of boys pooping in the latrines. Camp Baldwin, Oregon, 1988. I used to work as a lifeguard for a scouting camp situated on a huge lake, deeper in a pine forest. The kiddos would spend a week earning merit badges and swimming in the lake and getting splinters, then head home, only for the next batch to come out and do the same thing. This meant staff, like me, would spend a month or two living at the camp in tents. The staff campgrounds was a solid 10-minute walk from the showers, so if you wanted to be clean you had to walk the whole way down and back along this gravel road. Usually we went in groups, but occasionally we'd go alone. I'm walking down one night with my towel and sundries and I look up through the pine trees to see a bright light. Cool, I thought. That must be Venus or Jupiter or something. I reach the showers, basically wooden stalls hooked up to the water line, and as I'm showering I look up at this light. As I study it I realize it's way too bright to be a star or a planet. It's almost like a helicopter with a floodlight about 5 miles away, around 30 degrees off from being directly overhead. Thing is, there was no noise and the light wasn't moving. It's just there. I stare at it for a good 5 minutes, trying to figure out what the heck it is when it suddenly turns to the side and zips off. From the distance it was at, there was no way a helicopter could move that quickly. Not overly bizarre, I guess, but still weirded me out. Was camping alone at a nearby lake. I was in my late teens. I had basically bushwhacked to a remote part of the woods just off the shoreline. I grew up hiking and camping anywhere I could get to, so I was used to the skitters and scuffs and animal calls one sometimes hears in the woods at night. Sometime after I fell asleep, long enough for the small fire to just be embers, I woke up with this immediate awareness that I was not alone. I couldn't hear much over the bug noise of summer, but then I heard voices off behind me. I slowly threw as much dirt and rock onto what was left of the fire and waited. It sounded like someone whispering, or talking low. I strained my ears, but the harder I listened the more everything began to meld together. At one point it sounded like they were to my left, then minutes later, directly to my right. And once it sounded like the voices were tuning in and out like a radio, kinda quiet, then suddenly louder. I laid there motionless for hours. I fell asleep for a few hours after the sun was starting to come up. When I woke again, I packed up and crept back out of those woods. Just did not feel right. Haven't felt it since, thankfully. I love caving. Absolutely love it. I even joined a caving club. They send you an information packet once a month about featured cave tours. 1 month they sent out a packet containing a 7-8 hour wild man caving tour. I've been on wild man tours before, they're not too difficult. Maybe some rappelling or mild climbing. Nothing over an hour. This one had real danger, climb too much to the right and you get stuck. Slip too far and you can fall in a hole. Getting rescued in a deep cave is basically impossible. There were 5 of us, 3 tour guides, me and another person. About halfway though the cave they let us rest on this off-shallow ledge thing that was right next to the biggest drop-off of the cave. The guides told us how with larger groups they did the typical total darkness, had everyone turn off their headlamps and just look around. When he motioned to us to follow suit, we did. After about 30 seconds there was this sound. It honestly sounded like footsteps and then falling rocks and finally a screech. Immediately the head guide flipped on his headlamp and looked at us with a panicked glint. I think he thought one of us had fallen/jumped off the cliff. He turned to the other 2 guides and asked if they heard it. They did but couldn't explain it. They hadn't moved and us 2 were still there. He radioed to the surface and asked if any of the normal tours were missing anyone. This was about 3 hours away from the start of the Wild Man Path, and without our headlamps it was literally like staring into a wall of black. There was no way an inexperienced, or an experienced caver would have made it that far. The guides asked us if we wanted to continue with the experience and would understand and refund us if we decided not to. We went along and eventually completed the tour. Everything else was perfectly normal. I have no idea what that could have been. It wasn't animal footsteps, but that screech was blood-chilling. I used to work for various state parks/national forests in the south, a lot of the times in mountainous environments. Well, one day my task was to get rid of any illegal fire pits/circles/whatever that I see on or off the beaten path. So I'm hiking and looking around and I see something smoking in the woods in what looks like a clearing past a small thicket of trees. I head towards it to do my job. Is it an illegal campfire? No, it's a burnt up KKK cross that is still smoking. I noped right out of there. My husband, kid, and I live out in the middle of nowhere on a plot of land that's about 100 acres. I'd say probably 95 of those acres are wilderness with ATV and hiking trails that we, and several of the previous owners, created by exploring. We use that land for camping, hiking, and hunting. We like to find a spot, clear it a bit, and camp overnight. There's so much space we've never stayed in the same place twice. We've seen some kill sites, both old and fresh. Lots of animal tracks, places where deer bed down, etc. I've even spent a lot of time hiking solo while the kid is in school and husband's at work. Whether alone or with the family, we always carry a firearm for protection. A few weeks ago, we decided to load up our camping gear and start a new trail. We mark the trails we make with spray paint on trees. We were pretty far in the woods, having hiked almost an hour when the atmosphere seemed to change. I don't know who noticed it first, but my husband, who was leading the three of us, turned around and gave me a concerned look. The birds had stopped chirping, the insects were quiet. There were no sounds around us. When in the woods, complete quietness is rarely a good thing. We continued onward, hyper-aware of our surrounds while our kid continued merrily talking. We came to the stream that marks the midway point of our property. We stopped for a few minutes, my husband and I in a stare down with each other. We both felt something was off but didn't want to scare our daughter. I finally broke the silence and said I suddenly didn't feel good and that we should go home. My husband nodded in agreement while our daughter voiced her protest. Too bad, kiddo. We turned around and started back. After going a few hundred yards, still in silent wilderness, I looked to my right and saw a person crouched down in a ghillie suit about 150 feet off our trail. I'm positive they saw that I noticed them, but they never moved. I cleared my throat to get my husband's attention, and when he looked back, I put my hand on the gun in the holster on my hip, which caused him to readjust his rifle in preparation of anything. I sped up my family and we hurried back home. I told my husband as soon as we were inside. We decided to call the police and report the trespasser. Filed a report and was told to call again if we saw anyone. A few days later, my husband and I went out alone and set up a bunch of deer cams. We didn't go back out into the woods for maybe a week, then he and I ventured out to retrieve the cam footage. Out of the 9 cams we placed, we caught a person in a ghillie suit in 2 images. We handed copies over to the cops to go with our report. We haven't gone back out since except to check the deer cams. Haven't gotten any other trespassers. It freaks me out even more to think of the few times, while camping, that we heard walking near our tent in the middle of the night. We always assumed it was curious animals, but now I'm not so sure. I wasn't camping or hiking, but one night me and some friends were hanging out and someone pointed out that it was an incredibly starry night, so we went for a walk to a point where there's a great view of the whole sky. After a while, 2 bright lights appeared in the sky. Definitely not a helicopter as they were too far apart, but not a plane either as it was moving from side to side in a way that a plane couldn't. I tried to take a photo and my phone flash went off. Instantly, a spotlight pointed at us, before whatever it was turned around and disappeared in an instant, with red lights on the back of it. One girl we were with is convinced it was aliens, but the rest of us reckon it was some military drone or something. The creepiest bit was that, despite it being close to us, there was no sound whatsoever. Now this was about 20 years ago and wasn't really in seclusion, but nonetheless it is pretty disturbing. When my dad was young he would sleep over at his cousin's house during the weekends. The house was all one floor consisting of the front door entrance attached to the living room and kitchen. The living room had a long hallway for the bathroom, his aunt and uncle's room, then the bedroom where him and his cousin would sleep. His cousin's room was pretty small with only a bed, dresser and closet. The bed was pressed against the window, so when they slept they would face the closet and the doorway. One night at around 3 a.m. my dad recalls seeing shadows coming from the closet and tries to wake his cousin up, without any success. He doesn't see anything else or hear anything, so he falls back asleep. The next night, my dad hears a noise coming from outside the window behind the bed. He wakes his cousin up and they run to the bedroom where the uncle and aunt are sleeping, with nothing else happening for the remainder of the evening. A couple weekends later my dad stays over for another sleepover. This is where it gets weird. At some point late in the night, 1 a.m. my dad hears something from the closet and more shadows moving. Something must have freaked him out because he starts screaming and all of a sudden a man sprints out of the closet, down the hall and out the door. His cousin wakes up as well as his aunt/uncle. The cops come and do some investigating, but never end up finding anything. Basically the assumption is some creep has been sneaking inside the house and hiding in his cousin's closet. The window behind them would be easy for a creep to look in and inspect the area. Overall it just gives me chills when they tell me the story. They just seem so frightened of it still. I live at the base of a mountain, which is fairly secluded. No humans go there except for me and other people from my family. One summer evening, I decided to climb to the top, which takes about 2 hours, so I set off with my 3 dogs. When we got to the willow maze, which is exactly as it sounds, basically a field of willows with little trails and very limited vision, the dogs started to act a little weird, and while they usually run ahead and do the hike multiple times, they stayed right by me and seemed very anxious. Their anxious energy rubs off on me and suddenly I'm feeling eyes on me, and hearing rustling in the bushes. That's when I hear a faint laughter of a man, and that's also when I ran the fuck out of there as fast as humanly possible. When I got home, I told my dad and he told me that there was a murder in that area and that he hears that all the time, but didn't want to tell me unless he had to. I now stay to my regular route of avoiding the creepy but beautiful willow maze. I'm aware of how fake this sounds, and I wish it was. I was hiking in a remote, empty canyon by myself, with only my dog. A couple of hours into the hike, I started getting really paranoid. I couldn't figure out why, but I felt like someone was watching me. My dog started acting weird too. He was hanging really close to me while usually he roams pretty far, his hackles would go up randomly, and occasionally he'd run towards the wall of the canyon and stand up on his hind legs, sniffing intently. 2 or 3 times, he'd give a random little growl. But those instances weren't that common, and I thought I was just being paranoid. As we were leaving the canyon, I heard a little rock fall up on the wall and looked up to see a catamount staring at us. I'm 99% sure it had been stalking me for a while. As soon as we got out of the canyon and were walking on the Llano again, the creepy feeling vanished and my dog went back to chasing jackrabbits and mostly ignoring me. Okay, so I'm not outdoorsy, but I am very happy being alone and remaining in the same place for long periods of time. As such, I've been known, when either unemployed or on vacation, to take the time alone in an apartment or home, completely alone for possibly weeks at a time, basically until I run out of food. I think the longest I've gone was an entire month, if one doesn't count taking out the trash and seeing cars go by. If you do, then my longest in total seclusion was about a week. In all honesty, the scariest thing that's happened to me wasn't scary at the time, but in retrospect. Basically I went crazy. Like, straight up probably should have sought out help crazy. I started thinking I was being constantly judged by anyone and everyone. I stopped going outside. I stopped showering, or cleaning up after myself. I was also sure I was being tracked inside the apartment by audio, so I'd go completely silent, hoping my hidden enemies would think me sleeping. I ate sparingly, slept little, and basically spent a lot of time either silently staring at the walls or writing. Eventually of course I had to go out. Then, coming home, I slept from the after effects of adrenaline and mind-numbing terror, and in so doing reset my mind. Walking up after 6 to 7 days up in a paranoid nightmare, I cleaned up, went back to work. Vacation ended. My family has a cabin in a remote area of the Rocky Mountains. There's this one particular hike nearby that we would always go on when I was growing up that took you up a large hill, cut down into a ravine, and took you down to an abandoned mining cabin. It was really cool and the cabin was full of old antiques, books, cans, furniture, etc. So last summer I took my son on the hike to show off this cool abandoned cabin. It had been about 5 years since I'd been on this hike and it took us a while to find the trailhead because it was so overgrown. We hacked our way through brush and luckily I had a really good memory for the general direction we should be going. As we were heading down the ravine we finally saw the roof of the old cabin. Excited that we'd found our way through all the brush we headed towards it. But when we went inside, it was completely different than the last time I'd been there. Instead of cool old furniture and antiques there was a nest. This nest stretched from the floor to ceiling and across 2 entire walls of the cabin. But the most unsettling thing about it is that the nest was made of bones. Not small bones either, they were huge bones. One was the size of a human clavicle and others were bigger. I immediately had this terrible feeling and wanted to GTFO as soon as possible. Well, we booked it out of there and ran up the ravine as quickly as our dog could keep up. We reached the top in less than 30 minutes and were at the top of the hill where we could look down and see our own cabin below. We stopped to catch our breath at the top, which is fairly flat and has a lot of visibility. I decided to use that moment to try and get a signal on the sat phone from the high point. I got a hold of my mom and we were having a quick chat, but I kept hearing a strange noise. It was off in the distance though, so I couldn't make it out. But Miso was hearing it too and getting increasingly uncomfortable. I could finally make out the noise but realized that was because the noise was getting louder/closer. It was the sound of 2 metal objects being clanked together, like a spoon banging against a skillet. Then my dog gets super defensive and starts snarling and barking in the direction of where we just hiked out of. So now we are completely freaked the fuck out. I hang up the call, we grab our packs and run the rest of the 2 miles back to our cabin. We reported our experience and gave our photos of the cabin interior to the local Forest Service, who concluded that the nest was most likely a bear or cougar den. But that noise we heard following us out of the ravine will haunt my nightmares for years to come. We had this huge family event where everyone would take off for 2 weeks and go camping. The campsite took 7 hours to get to and was / one of the most popular places to go camping in my state. I was 16, so I brought a friend with me. We stayed in the tent because we like to stay up late and freak each other out. Well, one night I woke up having to use the bathroom. The outhouse was up near the end of the loop, so it was maybe a 5-minute walk to get there. I wake my friend up and we head up there. As we're heading back, we hear this scream. It sounded far away. We figured people were having fun over near the cabins or something, but decided to investigate and headed out to the lake. When we got to the lake, all we could hear was coyotes going fucking insane on the other side. The lake is like 5 miles wide and 15 miles long, so we knew they weren't close. We ran like hell back to the tent. These damn coyotes go crazy for the next 30 minutes. Then complete silence. That is until we hear something walking around our tent. You could hear whatever it was sniffing around and it plops down near the side of the tent. The outline was just this huge lump. Heavy breathing, and then this weird growl. It did not sound like a bear. But it stayed there all night, sniffing our tent, lying next to it. We were terrified. Of course we're not going to scream for help because that will just cause problems. Eventually we fall asleep and whatever it was had left by the time my family came out of the camper. It was probably a bear, but the growl sounded much deeper than a bear growl. Found out the screaming was from an actual bear encounter though. Some couple came out of their camper to find a bear tearing up their campsite. They weren't smart enough to hide the food, or stay in the camper. I spent a summer hiking across the US. In August I had decided to hike the JMT. There had recently been sightings and incidents involving a stalking mountain lion along the northern part of the trail. After the second day of hiking I decided to camp at the lonesome outskirts of Lower Cathedral Lake. On my way off the trail I passed one courteous family of 3 and meandered to a secluded spot on the far side of the lake and set up camp. I was woken in the middle of the night by loud huffing and sniffing noises around my tent. At first I thought I was just hearing things. The noises kept starting up every few minutes, getting more distinct and seemingly louder each time. I thought if I laid silent long enough whatever was in the area would pass by. It just kept on though. I finally drew up enough courage to bang a metal flask against the tent pole. The loud metallic noise caused a scudding of hooves that rapidly skirted past my tent and along the lakeside trail. At that point I realized I had been haunted by deer all night. I spend weeks alone in the woods by myself, and I used to go on group trips about 2 weekends a month for 10 years. I was born into camping and love it. Most of my outings are trips to the Ocala National Forest in FL and other state/national parks. Most odd occurrences are with other people and animals. I've stumbled into neo-Nazi rallies and clan gatherings several times. Multiple interactions with the odd hunter and their tracking dogs. However, last year finally opened my eyes to the danger of being alone. I was heading to my usual spot in Ocala, a free primitive campground next to a secondary creek, Yale Limnology, and noticed a Department of Corrections bus. The officer there stopped me and briefly inquired about my reasons for being there. I asked what was going because I was going to be camping in the area. He said a body was discovered by the road and was linked to case in the area, and the prisoners were there to search the area. The case was being built for a local man linked to the murders. I left the scene and went home rather than camping, thinking the entire time about last year when I was alone in my tent and heard footsteps outside. Assuming it was a bear, I pulled the slide on my handgun loud enough to be heard. But rather than an animal noise, it was the whispered hush of a man's voice, laughing. I think I avoided being part of that case. I think I've shared this story on here before, but when I was a young teenager I had to spend a night alone in the woods as part of a counselor in training program at a summer camp. It was early evening, my supervising counselors had already been by to check on me for the night, and I was embracing nature by hanging out topless when I looked through the thin cluster of trees separating my campsite from the lake and saw a man in a canoe watching me. Turns out the camp lake had one public access spot since you can't own water in that state, and the camp didn't own all of the land surrounding the lake. Most people respected that it was a camp full of young girls and stayed away, but not this guy. Needless to say, once my counselors got to me and found me topless and crying about some creepy dude on the lake, they were quick to call us in for the night. I've heard the camp doesn't allow solo overnights anymore. Friend of mine and his fiancée were hiking in Washington state. He usually takes a logging road as far into the wilderness he can go, then hike for a few days. Usually, he's gone for a week or so and comes back to tell us about his trip. Well, they go out and within 2 to 3 days they're back. He says he was easily 10 miles or so into the wilderness, when his girl needed to pee as they were hiking. She goes over to a less brushy area while he walks around a bit. When he looks back to her, there's a guy with no shirt on, about 30 feet away watching her. The guy isn't wearing a shirt, has brown canvas-type pants and very old working boots. He looks older, in his 40s or so, and like he's been living in the woods for years. The guy doesn't notice him, but doesn't really do anything other than just stand behind a tree and peek out now and then. He walks over to his fiancée and just says, "Don't look around, don't ask questions. We need to leave right now." My buddy has been hiking for over 30 years, Washington state for the last 20 years easy, he's experienced. He's also armed with a .40 caliber that he has in his backpack. It took them all day and into the night to get back to his truck. He says they were never followed. The thing is, even way out in a very remote area, you never know WTF is lurking or watching you. Nothing supernatural or what some would deem creepy, but I didn't sleep for a few days. I've camped and hiked for weeks at a time with and without other people. Was hiking with a group of troublemaker kids because my parents thought my teenage attitude was of the devil. They basically dumped us out in the middle of a state park with a map and a week of trail mix, a soda, candy bar, 5 adults, and 1 full MRE each. Anyway, our first night we set the fire watch schedule, and I was up with a buddy from 3A4A. We get up to relieve the other 2 and they mention they've heard lots of feet running around just beyond the fire. We think nothing of it and start playing some game. All of a sudden, there go the feet. They're running in circles in 100 directions. Finally, we wake up our leader and the other adults. We each turn on our flashlights and realize we're surrounded by a pack of coyotes. They were everywhere. Just circling and getting closer, and brave enough to start charging and backing off a little. Next thing we know, this huge, and probably old, his fur looked a little gray, one sits down and starts the yap. Cute kids grabbing the closest adult and bursting into tears. Then a second one joins in. Then a third. Then the entire pack just sits there yapping. It sounded like a distorted scene in a funhouse horror film. That pack followed us the entire week. We hardly slept, and eventually passed out from exhaustion. Our group ended up being the only one ever in the program history to leave with 2 days left. Bonus story, and friend and I went camping as a post-high school graduation trip in a local campground. We paid for a spot over by the lake so we could have easy access to swimming. I always have an emergency kit in my camp bag, first aid and sewing kits, compass, granola bars, feminine products, poncho and a flare gun. Well, we go to bed with our backpacks out and the rain fly in an empty cooler with heavy stuff on top. We wake up and she says, "Did you do that? That's not funny." "Do what?" Exit the tent, and someone had knocked over the cooler, opened my bag, and stuck pads and hung tampons around our campsite. We cleaned up. Packed up. Stopped by the ranger station and noped right out. We both swore the other did it, but I'm a light sleeper, anytime she moved it woke me up. She wanted to go to the bathroom, and we walked together the 50 yards on the lit road to the showers. She refused to camp with me again. But we both agree, we didn't do that. Sort of not related, but I was out in country lands of Texas on this remote trail mountain biking that I like to ride when in town. While riding through, I saw an older man ahead walking strangely, but I remember he was looking straight up at the sky. I see him about 60 yards ahead. It's a single track, so I don't have room to go around him, so I simply stop, and he hears me brake and turns to me now with his head level and looking at me. What happened next made my skin crawl. He starts talking and waving his arms, but his voice sounds nothing like he looks. It sounds like a child talking and sounding scared, but it was obviously a guy 50 plus years old. He keeps talking, but it's like someone is playing a recording from his body with his animations and mouth not lining up and his voice sounding off. I turned around and booked it back to where I parked my car and left quickly. He could have just been a wilderness loony with a child's voice, but there were no other cars at the trail entrance and he was a good 5 miles in without any gear or clothes that match a hiker at all. I hate remembering how he sounded in my head. During my senior year in high school, my friends and I did a big spring break camping trip in the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. We were backwoods and all but one of us were relatively experienced campers/outdoorsmen. Our campsite wasn't too far from the trail and only 2-ish miles into the woods which stretched deep. We had arrived and were prepping the campsite. We left a few things in the vehicles, and a few of us needed to head back to get another tarp and miscellaneous other things. 3 of my friends left and would be back in 90-ish minutes. Myself and my other friend remained and began to set up tents, dig a fire pit and gather some wood. I noted earlier that we weren't too far from the trail, but it was early in the camping season and we weren't close to many attractions, so anyone hiking around here was local. We had met 2 groups of people while hiking out and setting up. I was digging out the fire pit when these 2 guys approached our campsite. They asked for some water, which was no problem. But there was something off about them. I didn't like them. I alerted my friend to get them some water and kept my eye on them. We were 2+ miles deep in the woods and they didn't have any hiking or camping attire. Their mannerisms seemed slightly off and their line of questioning was too specific for my tastes. How many people? How long are you out here for? Where are you day hiking to? These questions are somewhat innocuous, but given their appearance, I tried my best to sidestep them well. Eventually I guess they got bored and wandered off. A day later, after our long day hike, we arrived back to our campsite exhausted. I always felt like things were out of place from when we left them when we got back. But I wasn't missing anything and no one else complained. The other event was that the very last night we were there, I had to use the restroom at around 5-ish in the morning. It was dawn and light barely broke through the trees. I walked away from my campsite and let loose, looking around with my flashlight as I did. In the distance I saw the movement of what looked like a black bear. It disappeared into the trees near my campsite. I was jolted with adrenaline and circled my campsite to check before going back to bed. Bryson City, North Carolina, the road to nowhere. So this doesn't get too long, here's the background for it. We decided to go camp near there and see this for ourselves. In the tunnel itself I started feeling weird, so I decided to not go back through it but take the trail to go over it. I was taking pictures and all, and my husband was going to record going back through and then meet me at the top of the trail, to go over together. I saw where he came up, took some more pictures. We realized we're on top of this tunnel and there are no trails, not even the one my husband just came up on that should have been maybe 5 feet behind him. There was graffiti and tie-offs everywhere, so it had been obvious. The phone is glitching and we have no signal. The time kept changing and then the images themselves start changing. Creepy but no big deal. I'll look through the camera. We were hoping for landmarks to get back to the original trail. The camera starts acting up. Same thing, the entire horizon, a set point, is completely different than what was just taken and is still right in front of me. Enormous trees are gone, from one image to the next. The time and date and settings won't stay the same. Eventually we start wandering, which we know is bad but we didn't know what else to do. Then, maybe 2 or 3 hours later, we get a spam phone call and realize, okay, in this second, in this spot, we have signal. We call 911 and they GPS track us, sending rangers out to find us. We get rescued, and go back through the tunnel, and we are an entire 0.1 miles from the car. The pictures from the top of the mountain and the pictures and video we just took, around other people even, are yet again changed. We leave to go back to the campsite and no more issues for the rest of the trip. Although we did get back, and upon looking up that campground there have been people missing from there, so thanks for telling us, lol. Edit. Just looked it up, Deep Creek Campground. I am finding at least 4 people missing that had been staying there or hiking near there. Was out camping for the first time with a few friends. When it was night there was a lot of growling and scratching from all around the campsite. At 4 a.m. it got quiet and we realized that everyone else was still awake, so we decided to get out and relight the fire and shit. I was the first to emerge from the tent, and when I shone my flashlight around I just saw multiple pairs of green eyes within the darkness of the forest just staring at me from every direction. When each of my friends emerged, some would blink out of existence, but others stayed and stared at us until the sun started to come up and whatever it was ran away. Some of the eyes were definitely raccoons, but others Well, let's just say that everyone was carrying at least a knife and we weren't going down without a fight. Not really creepy, but definitely scary. I was camping in my backyard on my trampoline with my best friend at the time. We were about 10. I lived on 60 acres on wood in Pennsylvania when a bear came out of the woods and was circling the trampoline and went under it. He absolutely knew we were there. First we tried to stay quiet, but it was bumping us from under the trampoline, so we screamed, "Bloody murder, bear! Bear! Help!" It was about 11 p.m. and my brother was still awake and came outside with his shotgun and intimidated the bear to come towards him to shoot at it to scare it away. It ran off and my friend and I went inside, and since that day, even when I go and visit my family at that house, I don't go outside at night. Wasn't my first or last experience being snuck up on by a black bear. They're very common in my part of the woods in PA. I was once hiking with my parents, when I was about 11. It was a fairly small series of trails, and me and my parents got into an argument, so I decided to head. After a while I couldn't hear any noises, no bird calls, in the forest, and I kept getting more and more lost. Eventually I started hearing footsteps crackling leaves behind me, and every time I looked behind me the noise would stop. I began to run for a few minutes, and for a little bit the noise stopped till it caught up with me again. As soon as this happened I kept running, and weirdly I came out of the forest and into the adjacent farm. It was an education center on farming or something like that. I found an employee. Turns out they had people looking for me and I was gone for hours. My parents were out there and eventually they came back and saw me. It was terrifying and indescribably surreal. I was doing some backcountry snowshoeing. Had a week off, so I thought I'd spend it freezing my ass off miles from anywhere or anyone. I got to base camp, which was basically just a parking lot, emergency phone, a posted map of the area, and a bunch of signs emergency rescue may be unavailable. Local frequency is 9,999. All that stuff. You're very alone in the backcountry. I only saw 3 people the whole time. The first guy was at base camp, but we set off in different directions. First few hours were pretty typical. Just a lot of nature and quiet, with the only sound being your own footsteps. I end up following a game trail through some woods. It started snowing and visibility got to be not so great. It did make for some fantastic pictures though. Then the snow got worse. Not to the point I needed to stop, but it was pretty borderline. If I hadn't been in the woods the wind might have been too much. I see some movement up ahead. Something else on the trail, and moving towards me. Pretty soon I can tell it's a man. We reach each other and stop to chat. Stopping to talk to someone is generally a really good thing to do out in the wilderness. For one, it's a break from the monotony of your own footsteps, and it might save your or their life if you're able to give rescue crews a more recent position. So it's pretty much standard practice to stop and chat for a little bit. This guy is maybe 50, in great shape with some high-end gear. I couldn't make out too many more features. It was cold and we were both bundled up. We stop and chat. But almost immediately something feels off. Like he's on guard. And as we chat he's really pushing his questions. Where you from? What brought you out here? You with anyone? Normally those questions wouldn't bother me, but whenever I answered incompletely he would push the question. On top of that his answers are always super vague. Name's John. I'm from a couple towns over. I worked nearby. He was really off-putting. The whole time we were talking it was like I could see the gears turning behind his aviators. Like he was thinking just how alone we were. And we were very alone. Our interaction ended when he reached for something on his hip and took a big step towards me. I was scared. He freaked me out. I jumped backwards and almost tripped on my snowshoes. I kept my balance though and had a hand on my gun. Oops, he chuckled, lost my balance there. Well, I have to get going. Stay safe. And he took off. Just started marching in the direction I had just come from. I didn't waste any time either. I started hoofing it. I kept looking over my shoulder every couple of seconds for a few miles. Now at this point I feel like I need to say it's not unusual for backcountry conversations to not really flow. Sometimes they'll hold you up for 20 minutes explaining that the bear scat they saw means there's bears nearby, or that there's a snowdrift a few miles away to look out for, and insist you watch out for it even when you say you're not headed that way. It's also pretty common for backcountry people to be armed. Sometimes animals get desperate, better safe than sorry. So if a backcountry person wanted to hurt you, they're probably more able than most. That said, he's the only guy I've ever met in the backcountry that made me feel unsafe. I once was exploring some woods near where I live. It was a while back when it goes from daylight to blackness in about half hour, so it was pretty dark and I got lost. Anyway, I'm trying to find my way back and I noticed this wooden-like hut. It seemed pretty quiet, so I thought, sod it, I'll check it out. So I get there and there's remnants of a fire. If I remember rightly, there was tarpaulin sheets with dried blood around it. I got a few pics, but Android cameras aren't great in the dark. I'll upload them if I work out how, but anyway, I noped out of there when I heard twigs breaking on the path behind me, thinking a murderer was coming, and as I very swiftly left on the outside of the hut was some symbol drawn in blood. I wish I'd took a photo, but I fully noped out of there. It was literally the creepiest thing ever. On top, when I went back with some mates a few days later, the tarpaulin and blood was gone. I thought this would have got buried and forgot. I'll upload them now, 1 second. So you can vaguely see the fire remnants. It's the stone circular thing on the floor in the middle of the room. The dried blood isn't really visible, but I think you can vaguely see small like stains of red on the floor and on some of the wooden beams. You can see where the tarpaulin had been thrown over the beams supporting the roof, and it had been cut, and there were specks of blood on that too. I don't know why it was there. I don't think anyone got murdered or anything, but still, it was the single creepiest place I've ever been. As I said, I wasn't gonna hang about, not when I heard crunching of twigs further back up the path. Literally every horror movie I've ever seen came to mind, and I just envisaged the reaction Leatherface would have had with me standing in his hideout. I will say though, if you want to go take photos of shit, don't take a Sony Xperia Z3 Mini. The camera's wank.